March 1st, 2025 began beneath a heavy, overcast sky in Seattle. The air was thick with the promise of an approaching storm, a fitting omen for the turbulence ahead, not just in the sky but within the walls of Blue Horizon Airlines Flight 305. At Gate 17, Eleanor Brooks, 76, clutched the strap of her faded canvas tote bag, her fingers brushing against its well-worn fabric. She wore a navy blue coat, the seams frayed from years of use, and a pair of scuffed, low-heeled shoes, the kind worn by someone who had spent a lifetime on her feet. Her posture was slightly hunched, her frame frail, but her eyes, though shadowed by exhaustion, still held a quiet fire. Eleanor had once been a costume designer, dedicating her life to her craft while raising her son, Lucas Cain, through years of sacrifice. Now retired, she rarely traveled, but today was different. She was flying to Boston to visit an old friend, a reunion she had long awaited. A rare moment of joy. But as she stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt an immediate shift in atmosphere. The air was crisp, almost sterile, a sharp contrast to the damp chill outside. She exhaled slowly and handed her ticket to a flight attendant, a young blonde woman in her mid-20s with a tight ponytail and an even tighter smile. Her name tag read Melissa. Melissa took one glance at the ticket and frowned sharply. "Eleanor Brooks, this is an economy ticket. First class isn't for you," she said flatly, her voice edged with impatience. Eleanor hesitated, her fingers trembling. Whether from the cold or nerves, she wasn't sure. I called ahead," she said softly. "They told me I could request an upgrade if there was space. I'm not as strong as I used to be, and I was hoping." Her voice trailed off, humble, never demanding, just the quiet request of someone who knew what it was to go without. Melissa let out a short, disdainful laugh. "Called ahead? And who exactly told you that?" She scoffed. "We don't hand out free upgrades just because someone hopes for it. First class is for paying passengers." With an exasperated sigh, she jabbed a manicured finger toward the back of the plane. "Economy is that way. Don't hold up the line." A flush of humiliation crept up Eleanor's neck as she pressed her lips into a thin line. She was not the kind to argue, but the cold dismissal stung. Around her, murmurs rose from the seated first-class passengers. A middle-aged man in a tailored navy suit, swirling a glass of red wine, leaned toward his companion and muttered, "Another one trying to sneak into first class. Happens all the time." The woman next to him, a sharp-featured blonde in her 40s, chuckled, shaking her head. They always think they deserve special treatment. Not everyone was so callous. A young woman, no older than 20, with dark hair and a phone in hand, lowered her device. Her brows knitted together as she whispered to her friend, "That's just cruel. She's old, she looks exhausted. They could at least be polite about it." Eleanor sighed, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. Shoulders slumping, she turned to leave, resigned to squeeze into economy. But before she could take a step, a voice cut through the murmurs of the cabin. "Hold on a second." The words came from a man in his 50s, standing with an air of authority. He wore a crisp gray suit, tailored to perfection, and carried a leather briefcase. His name was Jonathan Pierce. A veteran airline executive and a major shareholder of Blue Horizon, Jonathan had spent decades in the business. And right now, he did not like what he was seeing. His sharp gaze flickered toward Melissa. "She's elderly and clearly not well," he said, his tone edged with quiet disapproval. "You can't make an exception? I see empty seats right here." Melissa's posture stiffened. She crossed her arms, her voice rising in defiance. "Who are you to tell me how to do my job? Rules are rules. Empty seats or not, it's not hers. If you're feeling generous, give up your seat, but don't expect me to bend over backwards." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "This isn't about bending over backwards, it's about basic decency. You're humiliating her over nothing." Turning to Eleanor, his expression softened. "Ma'am, take my seat, I'll handle this." Eleanor shook her head, her eyes glistening with gratitude, but also hesitation. "Thank you, sir, but I don't want to cause trouble. I'll manage." She turned toward the economy section, her steps slow and deliberate. But the tension in the air was already thickening, just like the storm outside. And then, just as she passed the last row of first class, another figure appeared at the entrance of the cabin. Unnoticed at first, he had slipped aboard quietly, keeping his head down. He wore a faded denim jacket, dark jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. A man blending into the crowd, or so it seemed, because as his gaze swept the cabin, his eyes locked onto Eleanor, and in that instant, everything changed. It was Lucas Cain. Lucas Cain stepped into the first-class cabin of Blue Horizon Airlines Flight 305, moving with quiet purpose. His denim jacket was faded from wear, his dark jeans well-fitted but unassuming. A baseball cap rested low over his face, helping him blend into the crowd. He hadn't planned on drawing attention. This was a last-minute flight to Boston, booked in haste for a meeting with a film director. His intention had been simple: find his seat, settle in, and keep to himself. But everything changed the moment he saw his mother. There, at the front of the cabin, stood Eleanor Brooks, her small frame rigid with tension. The harsh voice of a flight attendant, Melissa, her name tag gleaming, sliced through the hum of boarding passengers. "Economy is that way. Move along. Don't hold up the line." Lucas stopped cold. A slow-burning anger ignited in his chest as he took in the scene. His mother's aged hands clutched her canvas tote. Her tired eyes, full of quiet dignity, blinked at the young woman before her, too polite, too used to being overlooked to fight back. And around them, mocking stares, disdainful whispers. He saw a man in a tailored suit, swirling a glass of red wine, mutter something to his companion. The blonde woman beside him laughed lightly, as if Eleanor's humiliation was a mere inconvenience to their privileged existence. Lucas's fingers tightened into fists. A gasp rippled through the cabin as passengers began recognizing him. The man in the suit, Anthony Wallace, let out a startled curse, his grip slipping. His glass tumbled, the deep red liquid splashing across his pristine pants. "Holy," he muttered, fumbling for a napkin. His blonde companion, Sabrina Clark, clapped a hand over her mouth, her amusement morphing into a stunned squeak. Even Melissa, the flight attendant who had dismissed Eleanor so callously, froze mid-sentence, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grip. Lucas Cain was more than just a celebrity. He was the owner of Blue Horizon Airlines, and he was furious. The tension in the air became palpable as he slowly removed his baseball cap, revealing the face the world knew so well. Whispers erupted. "Is that really him? No way. Lucas Cain owns this airline? Oh my God, that's his mom?" A few rows back, Olivia Tran, the young woman who had whispered in Eleanor's defense, immediately raised her phone, her hands shaking with excitement as she began filming. Lucas strode forward, his voice low but razor-sharp. "What did you just say to my mother?" The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Melissa paled, her confidence evaporating in an instant. "Mr. Cain," she stammered. I didn't know she was your mother." Eleanor turned, her eyes wide with shock. "Lucas? What are you doing here?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with confusion and, above all, embarrassment. Lucas exhaled, his rage momentarily softened as he met her gaze. "I could ask you the same thing, Mom," he said gently. Then his focus snapped back to Melissa, his expression hardening once more. "Why isn't she in first class?" "There are empty seats. Explain that to me." Melissa fumbled, her composure crumbling. It's policy, sir," she blurted out. "We don't upgrade passengers for free, no exceptions." Lucas took a step closer, his presence overpowering. "Policy?" he repeated, his voice like steel. "This airline is mine. I make the policies, and I didn't build it, so my mother or anyone could be humiliated like this." Turning to Eleanor, his tone gentled once more. "Mom, sit here." He guided her to the nearest first-class seat, ignoring the stares drilling into them from all sides. But the conflict was far from over. Anthony Wallace, still dabbing uselessly at his wine-stained pants, suddenly lurched to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Hey, Cain," he snapped. "I paid top dollar for this seat, not to watch some celebrity play hero and shove his mother into my space. This isn't one of your movies." Lucas spun around, his jaw tightening. "You paid for a seat, not a license to disrespect my mother. You've got a problem with it? Fine. I'll refund you double. Right now. But she's staying." His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, one that made Anthony hesitate. For a split second, uncertainty flickered across his face, but then he squared his shoulders, unwilling to back down. "Oh, you think you can just throw money around and call the shots?" he sneered. "I've been a VIP with this airline longer than you've owned it, pal." He jabbed a finger toward Melissa. "Do something. Get your manager up here." Melissa hesitated, clearly out of her depth. But before she could speak, a calm, measured voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." The older flight attendant, Henry Dawson, stepped forward, his graying hair and steady demeanor bringing a sense of authority that Melissa lacked. He turned to Lucas with respect. "Mr. Cain, I sincerely apologize. We'll handle this." Then he faced Eleanor, offering a gentle nod. "Miss Brooks, please stay. We'll make sure you're comfortable." As the plane taxied down the runway, the engines roared to life. But inside first class, the atmosphere remained charged with tension. Anthony Wallace slumped back into his seat, muttering under his breath. Typical Hollywood crap. Fame gets you everything. A few passengers nodded in agreement, their expressions sour, but not everyone. Olivia, still filming, whispered to her friend, "He's right to stand up for her. That guy was laughing at her 5 minutes ago." Beside Lucas, Eleanor exhaled deeply, her hand finding his. "Lucas, you didn't have to make a scene for me." Her voice was gentle, almost pleading, but he shook his head, squeezing her hand in return. "Mom, you never ask for anything. Not from me, not from anyone." His jaw clenched. "I'm not letting them treat you like that." From a few rows back, Jonathan Pierce, the airline executive, watched in silence. His mind churned. For years he had prioritized profits, cut costs, raised fares, trimmed staff. Now seeing Lucas defend his mother with such fierceness, something shifted inside him. A flicker of guilt, a realization. And as the plane lifted off into the storm, he knew. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jonathan Pierce sat in silence, his mind whirling. For years, he had been a ruthless businessman, a major shareholder in Blue Horizon Airlines, obsessed with profit margins, cost-cutting and shareholder value. It had been his guiding principle: trim staff, raise fares, streamline operations. But as he watched Lucas Cain fiercely defend his mother, something in him shifted. A pang of guilt, unexpected and uncomfortable, settled deep in his chest. Was this what he had allowed his airline to become? A place where a wealthy businessman like Anthony Wallace had more power than an elderly woman who had spent her life working hard. Across the aisle, Anthony wasn't finished. He shoved his wine-stained napkin aside and pushed himself up from his seat, his face still red with humiliation. His voice boomed over the hum of the engines, his rage unchecked. "Cain, this isn't over," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at Lucas. "You think you can waltz in here, flex your fame, and screw over paying customers? I'm suing this airline for discrimination. You hear me?" The moment hung thick in the air. A few passengers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to side with Anthony's anger or with the man they had just seen stand up for his mother. Lucas rose slowly, unfolding from his seat with the kind of quiet power that made the entire cabin hold its breath. He wasn't wearing a suit or a tie, just a simple denim jacket and jeans, but his presence was unmistakable, commanding. His voice, though low, carried an undeniable edge. "Discrimination?" Lucas repeated, his eyes locking onto Anthony's. "You mocked my mother for not being rich enough for first class. You tell me, who's the one throwing their weight around?" He took a step closer, his height towering over Anthony, his tone a near growl. "Go ahead and sue. I'll see you in court." He tilted his head slightly, his voice smooth but dangerously calm. "And trust me, you won't like the outcome." Anthony's face burned red, but Lucas's unwavering stare made him falter. For a moment it seemed like he might back down. Then he bared his teeth in a sneer. "You'll regret this, Cain." But his voice lacked the strength it had before. He slumped back into his seat, muttering curses under his breath. As the plane leveled off, Olivia Tran's video hit X, formerly Twitter, captioned, "Lucas Cain just owned first class to save his mom. Legend." The post exploded online, gaining thousands of views in minutes. Comments poured in. "This is why Lucas is the GOAT. Those snobs in first class suck. Money can't buy class. Protect Lucas Cain and his mom at all costs." At the front of the cabin, Henry Dawson, the older flight attendant, approached quietly. "Mr. Cain, sir, I'm sorry about Melissa." His voice was genuine, apologetic. "She's new. She doesn't understand what this airline is really about yet." Lucas offered a faint smile. "Just make sure my mom's comfortable, Henry." Henry nodded. "Of course, sir." He then turned to Eleanor with a warm expression. "Miss Brooks, can I get you anything? Tea? Water?" Eleanor, still overwhelmed, shook her head. "I'm fine, dear." But when she looked at Lucas, her eyes were misty. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Lucas, you didn't need to do this." Memories flashed through her mind. Long nights sewing costumes by candlelight, doing whatever it took to put food on their table, never imagining that one day her son would fight for her like this. Lucas squeezed her hand gently. "Mom, you never ask for anything. Not from me, not from anyone." His jaw clenched. "I'm not letting them treat you like that." Outside, the storm rumbled louder, lightning flickering in the distance. But inside, the real storm was just beginning. The first-class cabin had quieted, but the undercurrent of resentment lingered, simmering just beneath the surface. Anthony Wallace, still seething, couldn't let it go. He leaned forward in his seat, his voice dripping with venom. "You know what, Cain?" he sneered. "This is exactly what's wrong with the world. People like you think you can bulldoze everyone else just because you've got a famous face and a fat wallet." He jabbed a finger toward Lucas, his wine-stained pants a glaring reminder of his earlier humiliation. "I'm not some nobody you can push around." Lucas turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with restrained intensity. "You're right, Anthony." His voice was calm, almost conversational. "You're not a nobody." Then his tone hardened like steel. "You're just a guy who thinks a first-class ticket gives him the right to treat my mother like dirt." He leaned in slightly. "If that's your version of somebody, I'll pass." A ripple of unease passed through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of the exchange pressing down on them. Anthony's face twisted with anger, but there was nothing left for him to say. Still, he grabbed his phone, his fingers tapping furiously against the screen. "I'm calling my lawyer the second we land." His voice dripped with spite. "This airline is done for." Lucas didn't flinch. Eleanor, however, squeezed his hand, her voice a soft whisper. "Lucas, let it go." Her pleading eyes were the same as when he was a boy, getting into fights to defend her honor in their rough Toronto neighborhood. But Lucas shook his head. "Mom, he doesn't get to talk to you like that. Nobody does." Across the aisle, Jonathan Pierce had seen enough. For years, he had dismissed concerns about customer experience in favor of profit margins. He had justified cost-cutting measures, telling himself it was good business. But watching Lucas stand his ground for his mother? Watching Anthony act like he was above basic decency? Something inside Jonathan broke, and for the first time in years, he felt ashamed of his own company. As the plane shuddered through the turbulence, he loosened his tie, his mind racing. This wasn't over, and he had a decision to make. Jonathan Pierce exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie as he took a step forward. The tension in first class was so thick it was suffocating, and he had finally had enough. "Anthony, that's enough." His voice was firm, carrying the authority of a man used to making decisions. Anthony Wallace whipped around, his expression twisted in disbelief. "Who the hell are you? Another Lucas Cain fanboy? Stay out of this." But Jonathan didn't flinch. "I'm Jonathan Pierce, majority shareholder of Blue Horizon Airlines." His words were measured, deliberate, meant to cut through Anthony's bravado. "And I'm telling you to back off, or I'll have you escorted off this plane when we land, VIP or not." The threat hung heavy in the air. For a moment, Anthony stood his ground, jaw tight. But then, something in Jonathan's stare made him hesitate. He muttered under his breath and slumped back into his seat, his glare still locked on Lucas. Then, the plane lurched violently. A jolt sharper than before sent glasses clinking, trays sliding, and passengers gasping. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice came through, steady but urgent. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We've hit some unexpected turbulence due to a storm system moving in faster than anticipated. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We're working to stabilize." But the announcement only fueled the tension. Melissa, the rattled flight attendant, clutched her clipboard like a shield and scurried down the aisle toward Anthony, lowering her voice. "Sir, please, we need to keep things calm." Anthony waved her off, his frustration boiling over. "Calm? With this clown running the show? Fix this mess or I'll have your job too." Meanwhile, Olivia Tran, the young woman filming earlier, leaned toward her friend, her eyes alight with adrenaline. "This is insane." Her voice was almost giddy. "Lucas Cain, a storm, and now this jerk? It's like a movie." Her fingers flew across her phone, uploading another clip to X. Turbulence on Blue Horizon, inside and out. Lucas Cain still the GOAT. The post went viral instantly, comments pouring in. Anthony sounds like a total ass. Lucas literally owns the airline, and they still tried to mess with his mom? Protect Lucas and his mom at all costs. But first class was still in chaos. The plane rocked again, and Henry Dawson, the experienced flight attendant, approached Lucas and Eleanor, his presence a calming force. "Mr. Cain, Miss Brooks, can I get you anything?" His voice was gentle, sincere. "We're doing our best up here." He cast a glance toward Anthony, then back to Lucas, lowering his voice. "Don't let him get to you. Your mom's a class act. I've seen her kindness firsthand." Lucas nodded, a faint smile breaking through his frustration. "Thanks, Henry. Just keep an eye on her for me." Eleanor patted Henry's arm, her voice soft. "You're sweet, dear." "I'm fine, really." But her hands trembled slightly, betraying the strain of the ordeal. And then a cry rang out from the back of first class. A woman in her 30s, Rachel Carter, gripped her armrests tightly, her face pale. "We're going to crash, aren't we?" she gasped. "This is all because of this stupid fight." Her panic spread like wildfire, sending ripples of unease through the cabin, and Anthony seized the moment. "See?" he shouted, throwing his arms up. "This is what happens when you let egomaniacs take over. We're all screwed." Lucas stood up again, his voice firm but reassuring. "Everyone, relax. The pilots know what they're doing. Panicking won't help." He turned toward Rachel, his expression softening. "We're okay. I promise." The steady confidence in his tone seemed to anchor her, and she exhaled shakily, nodding. But Anthony wasn't done. "Oh great. Now he thinks he's the captain too. Give me a break." Then, in one sudden motion, he lunged from his seat, shoving past Melissa to confront Lucas directly. "You're a liability, Cain. This airline is a joke because of you." Lucas barely had time to react before Jonathan stepped between them, his patience finally snapping. "Anthony, sit down, or I'll have you restrained." "I'm not kidding." The weight of Jonathan's authority sent a clear message, and this time, Anthony finally backed off. Though his glare promised retribution, he slumped into his seat, arms crossed. The storm still raged outside, but something subtle was shifting inside the cabin. Rachel, the nervous flyer, pulled out her phone. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen, before typing a message to her estranged sister. "Saw something today that made me think of us. Can we talk when I'm back?" She hesitated a moment longer, then hit send, a tear slipping down her cheek. A few rows back, in economy class, a teenage boy named Noah Bennett scrolled through his phone, his eyes widening. He nudged his mom. "That's Lucas Cain up there, fighting for his mom." He swallowed hard. I should call Dad when we land." His parents had split years ago, and he hadn't spoken to his father since. But now, something about what he had witnessed made him rethink things. And at the front of first class, Jonathan Pierce sat back in his seat, lost in thought. For years he had been the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, the corporate man, the numbers guy. But what he had seen today? The raw loyalty between Lucas and Eleanor? The way Lucas refused to back down no matter how much power was against him? It stirred something in him. With a sigh, he pulled out his notebook and began scribbling furiously. Then, standing, he approached Lucas, his voice low but resolute. "Cain, I've been wrong about this airline, about a lot of things." He hesitated, then ripped a page from his notebook, handing it to him. "This is the start of me fixing that." Lucas took the folded note, opening it. And when he read the words, his eyes widened in shock. "Lifetime first-class access for Eleanor Brooks. No questions asked." Eleanor gasped, covering her mouth. "Oh, Jonathan, you didn't have to." But Lucas just nodded, recognizing a man trying to right his wrongs. And as thunder rumbled outside, one thing was clear. This flight? It had changed far more than just its destination. Jonathan Pierce's hand hovered over the torn page before he finally handed it to Lucas. "This airline should be about more than just profits." His voice was steady, resolute. "What you did for your mother today? That's what this company should stand for." Eleanor Brooks gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth as she read the hastily scribbled note. Lifetime first-class access for Eleanor Brooks. No questions asked. She looked up at Jonathan, eyes shimmering with emotion. "Oh, Jonathan, you didn't have to." But Lucas merely nodded, a quiet acknowledgement between two men who had been on opposite sides, but were now, perhaps, seeing eye to eye. Before another word could be spoken, the plane shuddered violently. A gasp rippled through the cabin as the overhead lights flickered, then went dark. For a moment, there was only silence, a single heartbeat of pure uncertainty, before the backup lights kicked in, casting eerie shadows across the first-class cabin. The intercom crackled, the captain's voice taut with strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing mechanical issues tied to the storm. We're diverting to Chicago for an emergency landing. Hang tight." A wave of panic surged through the cabin. Anthony Wallace leapt to his feet, his face a mask of rage and fear. "I knew it," he bellowed. "This is your fault, Cain. Your damn airline is falling apart." Melissa, the frazzled flight attendant, hurried forward, her voice unsteady. "Sir, please, remain seated." But Anthony waved her off, his panic morphing into blame. Rachel Carter, the nervous flyer, sobbed openly, gripping her armrests as the plane bucked against the wind. Yet through the storm, through the chaos, Lucas remained steady. He wrapped an arm around his mother, holding her close. "Mom, we're fine. They've got this." But even as he said it, he could feel the tension in the air thickening, not just from the storm, but from something deeper, more insidious. The plane trembled, tilting slightly as it descended toward Chicago O'Hare. Prayers were muttered, curses mixed with desperate whispers. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Anthony's bravado vanished. He clung to his seat, his fingers digging into the armrests as though they were the only things keeping him tethered to safety. Jonathan stared out the window, his notebook clenched tightly in his fist, the weight of his own decisions crashing down on him. At the front of the cabin, Olivia Tran filmed silently, her whisper barely audible. "This is unreal." The wheels hit the tarmac with a jarring thud, the impact sending a tremor through the aircraft. The plane skidded slightly, but after a tense few seconds, it slowed to a stop. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. But it was short-lived, because as the flight attendants prepared to deplane, a new voice crackled over the intercom. It was not the captain. It was a woman's voice, cool, commanding. "This is Special Agent Madeline Porter with the FAA. Remain seated. We are boarding to investigate reports of a disturbance and potential sabotage on this flight." The cabin doors burst open. Armed agents stormed in, their badges flashing under the dim lights. Passengers froze in shock, their relief immediately replaced with confusion and fear. At the front of the plane, Agent Porter strode down the aisle, her sharp eyes sweeping over the stunned faces before settling on three men. Lucas Cain, Anthony Wallace, Jonathan Pierce stepped forward. A ripple of disbelief ran through the cabin. Lucas blinked, his muscles tensing as Eleanor clutched his arm. "Sabotage?" Her voice trembled. "What are you talking about?" Anthony paled, his mouth opening and closing. "This is insane. I didn't do anything." "But Jonathan?" His face hardened, though he said nothing, stepping up beside Lucas without protest. Agent Porter held up a tablet, the screen displaying Lily's viral video, now synced with grainy cockpit footage. "We have evidence that an altercation in first class triggered a chain reaction." Her voice was unwavering, clinical. Shouting disrupted crew coordination, and an unsecured tray, knocked over during the dispute, jammed a critical control panel during turbulence. She looked up, stone-faced. "We're detaining all of you for questioning." The cabin erupted into shock and confusion. The first agent grabbed Anthony first, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists as he screeched in protest. "You can't do this. This is a joke." A second agent motioned for Lucas and Jonathan. Eleanor stood suddenly, her voice fierce despite her shaking frame. "No, you can't take my son." Lucas turned to her, his eyes soft despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Mom, it's okay." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a quiet resignation. "I'll handle this." As they were led down the aisle, Lily's phone was still rolling. The camera caught every moment. Live, Lucas Cain arrested after saving his mom. WTF just happened. The feed cut out abruptly as an agent confiscated her phone. Outside, rain lashed the tarmac, the wind howling through the airport lights. As lightning illuminated the scene, Eleanor sank back into her seat, silent tears streaming down her face. She clutched Jonathan's note in her trembling hands as though it were the only solid thing left in her world. She had never asked for any of this. Yet somehow, her quiet trip had spiraled into a storm that had reshaped lives, exposed truths, and left the entire world watching in disbelief. And somewhere in a cold holding room, Lucas sat staring at the wall, wondering how, despite everything, kindness had landed him here. Will Lucas face charges for simply standing up for his mother? Could the investigation uncover that Anthony was the true cause of the chaos? Or was Melissa's carelessness the real trigger behind the near disaster? The truth is still up in the air. Just like Flight 305.